I'm going to continue reading Chapter 8 called The Prisoner. All this time, my father had been charting the progress of the Soviets. It was our best hope, he said, that with the Russian army that had once so oppressed us would now be our saviors. Every day, my father would huddle with Sosha and study a map of Poland. Together, they would read between the lines of propaganda in the daily newspapers and try to gauge the progress of the war. They would read the German newspapers, the Russian newspapers, the Polish newspapers. In between, they would discover the truth of the war. Every day it was changing. One day the Germans were advancing. The next day the Germans were retreating. One day the Russians would enjoy a success on the front. The next day there would be a setback. As the Russians moved west, my father was pushing papers here and there, studying the situation. He would point to places on the map and say, "They are not here. They are not here." As always, he had to know what was going on. He was like a general, fighting to win the war on his pieces of paper. I listened in and allowed myself to become excited at these developments, but it was not always a positive turn. Kowalow noted with concern one morning that Wehrmacht officers were preparing a landmine operation on the streets around the church. The houses there had been abandoned and taken up by German officials, who of course wanted to see their homes protected from Russian tanks. Also, the Germans kept a headquarters office in this square, so they were taking pains to protect the high-ranking officials who worked there as well. As part of this initiative, German soldiers began tearing up the streets and placing active landmines just below the surface. This was a potential disaster for our party below, and Kowalow signaled Sosha and Wroblewski to return to the surface to discuss the matter. It was the middle of June 1944, and the German defense lines were beginning to collapse. This landmine operation was the last desperate measure to maintain control of all. Wehrmacht personnel were digging trenches along the city streets. There was such a noise that we could hear the hammering and the jackhammers below. We did not know what these noises might mean. At first, we thought the Germans had discovered our location and were breaking through to capture us from the streets above. Such was our narrow world view from our underground chamber. Thinking quickly, the three sewer workers approached the Wehrmacht officer, who appeared to be in charge. Our friends were dressed in their work clothing, so they had the authority to accompany their charade. Kowalow presented himself as engineer for the city sewer district. He told the officers that the sewers below were filled with pockets of explosive gases. Along every pipe, he said, there were also gas lines. He warned the officer that his soldiers were in grave danger by digging in this area without a map of the underground pipes. It was a suicide mission, he said, to lay landmines in such proximity to these explosive gases. It was even dangerous just to dig, he said, because if one of these gas lines burst, the entire area would be threatened. As Kowalow, Sosha, and Wroblewski made their arrangements above, we moved frantically to secure our position below. We did not know what was happening. We could only scramble to protect ourselves, and so began to cover the opening to our chamber with dirt and mud and silt. My father and some of the other men thought this would be a good strategy. We used some of the empty food storage tins to help move the dirt. It was a fool's mission, we realized later, but at the same time we feared we were about to be discovered. So the Germans were digging from above, and we were digging from below, trying to unearth enough dirt to conceal the opening into our palace chamber. Meanwhile, up above, there was such authority and concern in Kowalow's voice that the Wehrmacht officer put an immediate halt to the mining. He was not happy about it, but he did not want to put his men at risk. He did not want to go against the recommendation of this man who presented himself as an engineer and who spoke so convincingly about the danger of the gas lines below. Our sewer workers, of course, were extremely happy about this and knew that we had diverted disaster once more. Down below, our underground family breathed a happy sigh when the sounds of the digging suddenly stopped. We would have to wait for Sosha's next visit to learn what had happened, but for the time being, we knew we had been spared. A week or so later, we could hear the sounds of fighter planes flying overhead and bombs being dropped on the streets of the city. This development corresponded to the accounts my father and Sosha had been reading in the newspapers, but the events filled our chamber with a mixture of excitement and dread. We knew that the same bombs meant to liberate us might kill us first instead. An explosion on the street directly above our chamber would certainly compromise our sewer and the stone walls all around, and we would be crushed in the rubble. It was an anxious time, and the curious thing was that it was a good anxiety thrown together with a bad anxiety. We begun to believe our liberation was near, and this was a welcome development because we did not know how much longer we could survive in our primitive environment. It had been over a year since we had set up housekeeping in the palace, and although we had made the best of our unfortunate circumstances, we recognized that we could not remain here forever. Our health was quickly deteriorating, especially among the adults. Paul and I were mostly fine. After our initial bouts of dysentery and occasionally other ailments, we had developed a kind of immunity to the germs and the bacteria and the malnutrition. We were a sturdy and resilient pair. However, the adults in our group were experiencing more and more aches and pains as our confinement continued. Already we lost old Mrs. Weiss to these impossible living conditions. To live so long in such constant dampness, with so little oxygen, so little food, was only a matter of time before the others began to fail. My father noted in his memoir that some of the adults in our party were experiencing difficulty with their eyes because of the constant darkness. Others were experiencing joint pain and swelling. Others feared their spines would be permanently crooked from being constantly in a bent-over position. At night, when they thought everyone else was asleep, I could hear from my father whispering privately to my mother that we were reaching the end of our endurance. This was his worry. He whispered this in Yiddish, so Paul and I could not overhear, but I had learned enough Yiddish by this point to understand his concern. I knew that what Corsair said about the Yiddish language was not always so, because certainly there was nothing funny about my father's apprehension, even in such a joyful language as Yiddish. Probably my father was right to be so concerned. We were reaching the end of our endurance. We could only hope that our will to live would outlast the Germans' hold on our city. Our underground family received an unannounced visitor toward the end of June 1944, almost 13 months into our confinement. Sosha Wróblewski arrived one day with a Ukrainian soldier, a young man who was the boyfriend of Sosha's sister-in-law. His name was Tola. He did not look like the sinister Ukrainians I'd been accustomed to seeing on the streets of the ghetto before we escaped into the sewer. I guess he was in his early 20s. His face at first seemed kind and handsome. He had light blonde hair, and he was both skinny and strong. Of course, we were all dreadfully skinny after so long without proper nutrition, but Tola was naturally skinny. He appeared rail thin, but also powerful. We were so surprised to have a visitor at long last. I had not realized how hungry we were as a group to engage in conversations with someone new, to participate in normal social exchange, to make a new acquaintance in a basic human interaction. And we had been without such an opportunity for so long. For his part, Tola must have been shocked at our appearance. Sosha Wróblewski saw us every day, so did not notice how emaciated and haggard we had become. We must have looked like the starved prisoners in the concentration camps, for all we knew. A young man like Tola was not so hungry to make our acquaintance. Our clothes were tattered and torn, our bodies beaten down by unnatural conditions. To his credit, Tola did not remark about our unsightly condition. He simply made the appropriate greetings and attempted to adjust to his new surroundings. Very quickly, we learned Tola's story. Like many Ukrainians, he had been fighting in the Russian army. Unfortunately, he was captured by the Germans and made prisoner of war and forced by his captors to fight against his own countrymen. This was a famous German tactic to turn their prisoners into traitors, and these were considered the lucky ones. The prisoners who did not join the German army were warehoused in camps that resembled the concentration camps, or they were simply killed. Tola would not fight against the Russians. He wore the German uniform for a short time until he managed to escape. Somehow, when he was in hiding, he met Sosha's sister-in-law and fell in love with her. Her name was Michalina. It was a dramatic romance, and even more dramatic because of the underlying danger, because Tola was a man without a country. The Germans would kill him for deserting, and the Russians would kill him for fighting for the other side. He had no place to turn. Clara and Helena were especially attracted to the romantic, forbidden elements of Tola's story. They thought it would be a grand adventure to help two young lovers survive their tragic circumstances so they could one day be together. It was Wanda Sosha who suggested to her husband that he consider hiding Tola in the sewer among with his precious Jews. He was her sister's boyfriend, after all, and he at least deserved the same chance as a group of Jews who had been strangers to their family. It would be nothing, she thought, for us to add another hideaway to our group, and Sosha had no choice but to agree. Sosha explained our situation to Tola. He described our palace home, how we were living, how we built our own little society in the underground world. He made it sound as though it were not so terrible, because for him, it was not so terrible. Sosha explained that he himself chose to spend many long hours with us in this place. He described our various personalities and told about the hen and her two chicks and the plays we liked to perform. He assured Tola that he would be welcome in our group and care for him as one of our own. Tola agreed that this would be a good place for him to hide until the Russians once again controlled the streets of Lviv, and he could at last explain his situation to the authorities. Already the Russians had been moving farther and farther into the region, and it seemed from newspaper accounts that our persecution under the Germans would not last much longer, and so it was arranged. However, we did not know of these arrangements. Tola simply arrived in our midst without warning. We were shocked to see this stranger, certainly, but by this point we trusted Sosha implicitly. If he told us to take this man into our company, we were only too happy to do so, and Tola made a fine first impression. He was agreeable and pleasant and grateful for the sanctuary we offered. Indeed, when he first crawled through the pipe into our chamber, it felt to all of us as though the Ukrainian soldier were a guest in our home. But the spirit of welcome left us almost as soon as Tola arrived. He could not get used to our dungeon-like surroundings. He could not understand how we could live in such a filthy place. He could not stand the mud, the stench, the cold, the rats. "You are like animals here," he said. "And you have been here for 13 months? I could not survive 13 hours in this place." However, Sosha persuaded Tola to keep an open mind, and soon our sewer workers left to continue their rounds. Tola stayed behind, and we of course assumed he would become gradually accustomed to these surroundings, as we had become gradually accustomed. But in this we were wrong. Tola could not last even one day. He could not rest. He became very agitated, almost claustrophobic. "How can you live here?" he kept saying. "It is impossible." Remember, this was a man who had survived for several weeks in a German prisoner of war camp, where the conditions were unspeakable. That he could endure, this he could not. Tola became frantic and restless as his first day in our company wore on. Soon he was telling us he had to leave, but my father did not think this was a good idea. He had not discussed this possibility with Sosha, and Tola would not wish to remain in the sewer. But he did not think Sosha wanted this prisoner of war wandering the pipes and tunnels of the sewer on his own. Certainly, he would be discovered if he tried to leave, just as the others had been discovered. For Tola's sake, for our sake as well, he would have to remain, at least until Sosha and Wroblewski arrived the next morning. At that point, Sosha would determine an appropriate course of action. It was quietly decided that the men would take turns watching Tola in 4-hour shifts to make certain he would not flee and possibly give away our location. Several times Tola rushed to the open pipe and attempted to crawl his way through until one of the men grabbed him by the legs and pulled him back toward our chamber. Crying out loud. Sorry, I had to let my dog in the room. He was scratching at the door. When this happened, another one of the men would join in the capture because the young soldier was too strong for one man to pin down. With each failed escape, Tola became more and more agitated, more and more difficult. He became like a madman. There would be little sleep for any of us on this night. There was so much agitation and difficulty in our small chamber. It was a wonder to me that those long hours passed at all. Such was the slow anguish of Tola's first night among our group, until finally Sosha Wróblewski arrived the next morning. Sosha was startled to hear about the trouble his soldier had caused. My father explained the situation, and Tola did not dispute his account. Tola said he could not stay here, but Sosha said he had no choice. He said he could not risk allowing Tola to return to the outside, that he could no longer trust Tola to keep quiet about our location or about the sewer workers' conspiracy to conceal us. Tola assured Sosha that he would keep our secret, but Sosha would not take the chance. He told the Ukrainian he had put our group in a predicament. At this, Tola's agitation returned in full force. He tried to reason with his girlfriend's brother-in-law, but now he became hysterical. He flailed about in our small chamber, yelling and screaming. We feared his shouts would give us away. He quieted only when Sosha drew his gun. "Shut up, or I will shoot," Sosha said. At last Tola was quiet. Sosha crossed to where my father was sitting and gave him his gun. "Chiger," he said, "you must watch this man. You cannot let him leave." Then he produced a length of rope, which he wound around Tola's hands to restrain him and restrict his movement. "This way he cannot crawl," Sosha explained. Once again, Tola became a prisoner of war. Not only was he being held by our underground now he was being held by our underground sovereignty. Now the men in our group would be his guards, and they would resume their 4-hour shifts behind the barrel of Sosha's gun until we were liberated or until Sosha came up with another plan. We meant this young soldier no harm, of course, but at the same time we could not allow him to threaten our survival. And so began the unexpected final chapter of our time in the sewer. A new character who had not been part of our story was now placed in a central role. I did not like that this man had come to stay with us. I did not like that the camaraderie of our group was now upset. After a year or more in our underground palace, we had become comfortable with one another and established in our routines. Now, with Tola, we could not be as we had been before. I could not sit with my father and study my letters. We could not sit in the evening and perform one of my father's plays or satires. We could not be ourselves. Even such a simple thing as going to the bathroom was disturbed by Tola's presence. Always we had enjoyed only the illusion of privacy. But now, with the stranger among us, we could not relieve ourselves without feeling self-conscious. I do not think, for example, that any of us ever relieved ourselves when Sosha Wróblewski came to visit. We only went when we were alone. This was a curious thing, and yet we have developed such an intimacy among our group that this is how we maintained our civility. We developed our own bathroom routines, our own personalities. When we had to use the chamber pot, some of us were quick, some of us took our time. Me, I like to sit and think. Sometimes I would sit so long that my mother would call out to me from the shadows to make sure I was okay. Now, however, we were all very quick to do our business. When Tola needed to use the bathroom, we were all a bit embarrassed. It was like a violation. Even now, the illusion of privacy was no more. Paul, too, was disturbed by Tola's presence. Only he did not care so much about having to use the bathroom. He cared about Tola's disposition, which grew more and more angry each hour he remained with us. Tola would kick at the rats that had become Paul's friends. He was more sour and disagreeable than Weiss and his cronies had ever been, and we had not seen those men for nearly a year. Paul could sense the soldier's foul demeanor and bad temper he had brought with him into our small chamber. We had lived a long time in our self-contained little world, with our eccentricities and personality, but somehow we managed to get along. We had learned to coexist. With this hostile stranger among us, a virtual prisoner, I realized for the first time that we were prisoners too. I had not thought of our circumstances in just this way until this moment. Tola, he could not go anywhere. His hands were tied, and he was held at gunpoint against his will. And the rest of us, we could not go anywhere either. Our hands were not tied, and we were not being held at gunpoint, but we were prisoners just the same. We too were being held against our will. I did not like to share this observation with my father and the others. I did not like to think that anyone would appreciate the observations of an 8-year-old little girl. Instead, I kept quiet and silent and prayed that things would go back to the way they were, whether I was praying that things would go back to how they were before the war, before the initial Soviet occupation, before the German occupation, before our time in the ghetto, before the final liquidation, before our confinement in the sewer, or before Tola's arrival had upset the fine balance of life we had finally made, I could not say. I was not self-aware enough to know the full extent of my deepest thoughts, only that I too was restless, a prisoner of my own unfortunate circumstances. That was chapter 8. I'll read chapter 9 tomorrow.